Как живешь?
Хорошо.
Что это у тебя такое?
Глад.
Глад? Прилетел, да?
Да.
Только первый грохот, я не знаю, с какой стороны мы услышали. Я говорю, давай бежать. Все, уже другого выхода нету.
Он бахает в этой стороне, и в этой, везде бахает. И дом бомба прямо попала. Да так бомбили, что мне уши закладывало. Всю ночь стреляли до утра.
Прям ракеты перелетали. Я теперь поняла, как сердце болит.
Я сидел рядом с окном, и раз, и у нас залетел снаряд. Мы добежали до двери, и все начало сыпаться. А там осколки попали в кишу.
Когда все развеялось, лежу тут лежит сын мой, мама. Тут лежала, тут свекровь лежала вот тут на этих воронках. А там чуть дальше дедушка наш мертвый лежал. Я детей похватала, побежала с ними в подвал. А когда уже в подвале посветила фонариком, увидела, что у ребенка нет пальца.
И вчера, когда я его выносила, он мне говорил: мама, я ведь только начал жить. За что?
Я когда увидел маму с папой, бежаешь, мне было страшно. Чисто было страшно смотреть на них.
What's left of a nation so torn, being played against each other from the day that we're born? What's left of a country stripped bare by greedy corporations and rapacious billionaires? What's left? Once the vultures are through, will there even be a country left for me and you? What's left? Once the fantasy fades and there's nothing but reality to smack us in the face, what's left are a people in pain, abandoned by their government and struggling to maintain. What's left is a nation enraged, with more and more becoming disillusioned each day. I'm left, and I'm here to stay, to make you feel uncomfortable and show you a better way. I'm left, but I'm not alone. There's millions more just like me, and not one will they own. We're the left, and we won't be ignored. The masses have been ignited, so brace for the storm. I said we're left, and we won't be ignored. The masses are ignited, better brace for the storm.
I'm sure by now everyone knows that there is a war going on in Ukraine. But what you may not know is that the war did not just start in February of this year, but in February of 2014, after a US-backed coup installed a puppet regime with the help of literal Nazis, who for their loyal service were rewarded by being legitimized and quickly incorporated into the new government. And calling them Nazis is no exaggeration. They proudly adorned their uniforms with SS symbols, swastikas, and other patches celebrating Nazism. And their leader was once quoted as stating, "The historic mission of our nation in this critical moment is to lead the white races of the world in a final crusade for their survival." Shortly after the coup, this far-right fascist force was armed with American-manufactured arms and set loose on the historically Russian-speaking region known as the Donbass, where, over the course of 8 years, 13,000 to 14,000 people have been killed, including 25% civilians, according to the UN. We'll go over all of this in more detail in a moment, but first, here's the rest of that clip from years ago, taken while puppet president Petro Poroshenko was still in office.
Скажите, пожалуйста, почему вы никогда не говорите правды?
Это не ДНР нас убивает, а вот эти фашисты, которые окружили нашу Авдеевку.
Порошенко хочет войны. И он не понимает, что такое мир. Нас Порошенко предал. Но я хочу, чтобы был мир. Чтобы все люди мирились, даже если чуть-чуть поссорились. И не хочу, чтобы было никаких ссор. И никогда больше не было войны. Пусть они, допустим, завтра это все закончат. И не будет войны больше никогда, 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 никогда.
I completely agree. Peace is the only path forward. But before we get there, we need to understand how we got to where we are now. And unfortunately, it's due in large part to the foreign policy of the United States, which in no way absolves Russia of any war crimes it has or may commit. But I'm here to give you the context that the mainstream media conveniently leaves out. So let's start at the beginning. At the root of the problem is NATO. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization was founded in the early days of the Cold War as a direct opposition to the USSR that, in the words of the alliance's first Secretary General, Lord Hastings Ismay, existed for 3 reasons: to keep the Russians out, the Americans in, and the Germans down. And even though the USSR has not existed for over 3 decades and actually disbanded its counter-alliance, the Warsaw Pact, since its dissolvement in the early 90s, the military organization has doubled in size. Even though, as a condition of German reunification, the Russians were assured that NATO would not move 1 inch eastward. But that is exactly what happened 14 times over, with many of its new members being former states of the Soviet Union itself, to the point we're at now where US and NATO forces nearly encircle all of the Russian Federation, which is distinctly not the Soviet Union. And I think we all know exactly how the US would have handled the situation had the shoe been on the other foot. Only they would have done it long ago. And again, this does not justify anything that Russia is currently doing, but it does put it into some much needed and often omitted context, and was completely predictable, as many journalists, politicians, and statesmen have been warning for decades. As the American diplomat and former ambassador to the Soviet Union, Jack F. Matlock Jr., warned while testifying in front of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee on the topic of expansion back in 1997, stating, quote, "If it should be approved by the United States Senate, it may well go down in history as the most prolific strategic blunder made since the end of the Cold War. Far from improving the security of the United States, its allies, and the nations that wish to enter the alliance, it could well encourage a chain of events that could produce the most serious security threat to this nation since the Soviet Union's collapse." The late great Russian historian and American scholar Stephen F. Cohen concurred and warned of the hypocrisy of NATO's expansion, stating, "NATO expansion represents the following to Russia: a profoundly broken promise to Russia made by the first Bush, that in return for a united Germany in NATO, NATO would not expand eastward. NATO represents on the part of Russia a lack of trust. You break your words to us. To what extent can we trust you? Secondly, it represents military encirclement. If you sit in the Kremlin and look out at where NATO is and where they want to go, it is everywhere on Russia's border. NATO expansion represents for the Russians American hypocrisy and double standard. They see it this way, and I cannot think of any way to deny their argument. The expansion of NATO is the expansion of the American sphere of influence, plain and simple. Where NATO goes, our military forces go. Where NATO goes, our arms munitions go, because they have to buy American weapons, which is literally a stipulation of NATO membership and very convenient for arms dealers, but I digress. In regards to Ukraine specifically, here's a short clip of Noam Chomsky explaining why offering them an invitation to NATO is an exceedingly bad idea.
The idea that Ukraine might join a Western military alliance would be quite unacceptable to any Russian leader. This goes back to 1990, when the Soviet Union collapsed. There was a question as to what would happen with NATO. Gorbachev agreed to allow Germany to be unified and to join NATO. It's a pretty remarkable concession, with a quid pro quo that NATO would not expand 1 inch to the east. That was the phrase that was used.
So Russia has been provoked?
Well, what happened? NATO instantly moved to East Germany. Then Clinton came along, expanded NATO right to the borders of Russia. Now there are the new Ukrainian government, the government after the overthrow of the preceding one, the parliament voted, I think 300 to 8 or something like that, to move to join NATO.
Which you can understand why they would want to join NATO. You can see why Petro Poroshenko's government would probably see that it's protecting his country.
No, it's not protect. Crimea was taken away after the overthrow of the government, right? He's not protecting Ukraine, is threatening Ukraine with major war. That's not protection. The point is, this is a serious strategic threat to Russia, which any Russian leader would have to react to. That's well understood.
And to those that might be thinking that recent events have justified the expansion of NATO rather than lead to them, I point you to the words of American diplomat and historian George Kennan, who said, quote, "I think it is the beginning of a new Cold War. I think the Russians will gradually react quite adversely, and it will affect their policies. I think it is a tragic mistake. There was no reason for this whatsoever. No one was threatening anyone else. He goes on to say, of course there is going to be a bad reaction from Russia. And then, those in favor of NATO expansion will say that we always told you that this is how the Russians are. But this is just wrong. And I have to agree. For the most prescient and prophetic warning, I give you yet another U.S. diplomat, the former ambassador to Russia and current director of the CIA, William Burns, who in February of 2009 wrote an internal memo that was intercepted by WikiLeaks titled, "Niet means Niet, Russia's NATO enlargement red lines," where he warned that further eastward expansion was a potential military threat, predicting that the issue could potentially split the country in two and lead to a violent civil war that would force Russia to decide whether to intervene or not, which unfortunately is exactly what has happened. I could go on and on and on, with journalists and U.S. statesmen from both sides of the aisle warning of the dangers of NATO expansion, but I think you get the point. This outcome was very predictable and nothing but a self-fulfilling prophecy, which begs the question, why? Which is a great question and one that should be explored, but I still have a lot of ground to cover and context yet to explain. So let's move on to the Ukraine itself. The United States has been meddling in the country since at least the end of World War II, when the CIA helped Ukrainian Nazis evade the Nuremberg trials in order to use them as proxies against the Soviet Union in the new Cold War. But for the sake of brevity, we will fast forward to the US-backed and sponsored coup that took place in 2014. Though it must be pointed out that Ukraine has a long and complicated history with deep cultural divides. Long story short, Western Ukraine has historically associated itself more with the West and considers itself to be European, while the eastern half has much stronger ties with Russia, which it was a part of for many decades and still shares a language with. As a result, the political power in Kiev has always had to walk a fine line in order to keep peace between the two distinct sets of people. Which is not to say that they were always at each other's throats, but just that the underlying tension was there. Tension that the West was all too eager to exploit. In November of 2013, the president at the time, Viktor Yanukovych, turned down a loan from the International Monetary Fund because of the strict austerity requirements tied to it. He instead chose to go with a more generous Russian offer that did not require the harsh austerity measures, which would have hurt the already struggling Ukrainian people. This decision triggered a wave of protesters to flock to the Maidan Square in Kiev, who favored an EU partnership over the Russian agreement. At first, the protesters were completely peaceful and even jovial, with men, women, and children of all ages coming out to the square to voice their discontent. But at the same time, the US was flooding the region with money via various NGOs or non-governmental organizations, with the National Endowment for Democracy or NED financing no less than 65 projects leading up to the time of the coup. I can't tell you exactly how much money was funneled into the area, being that the NED has conveniently and very conspicuously deleted all records of its projects in Ukraine. But I can tell you that since the coup, the NED has funneled at least $22 million into the highly volatile region. And for a brief summation, the National Endowment for Democracy is nothing short of a CIA cutout, which took over regime change operations for the agency after numerous scandals brought unwanted scrutiny and attention to their crimes. Attempts at spreading democracy. So in 1983, under the guise of promoting human rights and democracy, the newly formed nonprofit got to work destabilizing countries that were not fully committed to the capitalistic goals of the US empire. Or, as their first president puts it, a lot of what we do today was done covertly 25 years ago by the CIA, which admittedly is a very daunting task, though they do have plenty of experience to draw from. And one of the favorite tactics for regime change efforts is to arm and support the most extreme right-wing factions in the area. In Afghanistan, it was the Mujahideen. In Nicaragua, it was the Contras. In Syria and Libya, it was offshoots of Al-Qaeda. And in Ukraine, it was literal, unabashed Nazis. Specifically, members of the far-right fascist groups the Svoboda Party, which is now a legitimate political party in the country whose leader you can see here zig howling, and the ultra-violent group of thugs known as the Right Sector. I'll be going into this topic in more detail in my next video, but these Nazis have direct ties to the Ukrainian Nazi collaborators such as Stefan Bandera, who fought alongside Hitler's invading army during World War II, committing multiple massacres of the Jewish, Polish, and Russian people. These were all somewhat fringe groups until they were legitimized and incorporated into the Ukrainian government post-coup. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Another often used and effective tactic for these types of operations is to use the media to manipulate the masses by pumping the airways with incessant propaganda. So it just so happens that on the very day the protests began, one of 3 new media outlets aimed at criticizing the Yanukovych administration while venerating the opposition took to the airwaves, with the other 2 following suit within days. This is also around the time that U.S. politicians and State Department officials, including Undersecretary of State Victoria Nuland, remember that name, began to show up at the Maidan Square, in some cases to hand out bread and cookies to the crowd, and in others to outright egg on the protesters.
We will be back here on this square to celebrate with you a Ukraine that stands with Europe and stands with the United States.
Well, members of Congress were visiting Ukraine during that period, most famously Congressman John McCain. So some of the people who were challenging their government, their elected government at that point, were being told by the senior U.S. official, a person who ran for president and a top official in the U.S. Congress, that the U.S. was with them.
I'm Senator John McCain, and it's always a pleasure to be back in Ukraine.
Senator McCain was, in a sense, giving the people in the Maidan a feeling that they had the backing of the most powerful country on earth.
This is about the future you want for your country. This is about the future you deserve.
This is when the tone and character of the protest took a decided turn towards the more extreme, as many young men began showing up sporting flags and other symbols of far-right fascist groups such as the Right Sector, and armed with bats, pipes, and other blunt objects, and eventually even with guns. Acts of violence became a regular occurrence as protesters began regularly provoking and outright attacking the police and storming government buildings. An insurrection, if you will, and eventually an outright coup.
News media reported that the riot police cruelly attacked the students peacefully sleeping in their tents. But scenes from the event seem to tell a different story. It appears that the protesters were waiting for the police. Additionally, there were dozens of journalists and cameramen from all the new public TV news outlets prepared to cover the events. And most ominously, a group of well-trained young men arrived to Maidan almost simultaneously with the riot police. They infiltrated the crowd and began provocations with insults, stones, and torches.
The right sector in Ukraine represents a part of the Ukrainian population that has often favored fairly extreme right-wing positions. They had militias that came especially during the Maidan protests. There were groups that were being shipped into Kiev where they would provide the muscle, in effect, for the demonstrations. So the demonstrations went from being relatively peaceful political protests to be increasingly violent.
Unfortunately, by February of 2014, things got even worse, as deaths on both sides became daily events.
For weeks, this European capital has been the scene of a violent uprising. Today, the bloodiest day yet.
The protesters are pushing up towards the government district, armed here with Molotov cocktails, but we saw handguns and shotguns too. There are casualties on both sides.
Well, she's just said that there are 6 dead people up there. Not just injured, dead. They said they've been hit by snipers.
49 protesters as well as many police officers were confirmed to die on that day, and over 100 more were wounded, with most of the casualties coming via sniper fire. I don't have time to go into all of the details, but for a more comprehensive account, I recommend watching Oliver Stone's documentary, Ukraine on Fire, the first of 3 he's done on the subject of Ukraine. If you are able to find it, that is. Google has since removed it from its YouTube platform, even though it had been on the site for years with no issue. But unfortunately, it and many other sources that do not entirely align with the state-approved narrative are being thoroughly scrubbed from places such as YouTube and Facebook. But luckily, there are a growing number of alternative platforms out there, and the film still can be found at such places like Vimeo and Rumble. The clips I have been showing you are from this film. And for a more thorough accounting of the sniper attacks themselves, I point you to the work of Ukrainian scholar and current professor at the University of Ottawa, Ivan Kochanovsky, who has compiled quite a lot of evidence on the events of that bloody day. Such evidence includes video testimonies by more than 100 wounded protesters and several hundred other witnesses, including several dozen witnesses from the Maidan massacre trial and investigation, as well as forensic ballistics and medical examinations done by Ukrainian government experts. And for some context, this trial was put on by the new Coup government that was actively trying to pin the blame on the Yanukovych administration, which is not to say that everyone inside the government was in lockstep with its new leadership. And ultimately, despite the massive amounts of verified videos, testimonies, eyewitnesses, and forensics, the investigators were not able to convict nor even arrest anyone for any wrongdoing, though that certainly doesn't mean there was not a treasure trove of damning information to come from the trial. While there was no evidence that the Yanukovych administration had ordered its commanders to fire upon the protesters, and not a single government official nor member of the security forces has come forward to admit involvement or reveal any evidence of a government order to shoot protesters, there was plenty of evidence pointing to the opposition being responsible for the massacre. Several Maidan leaders and activists provided testimony, including no less than 14 members of the Maidan sniper unit who openly admitted at both trial and during media interviews that they themselves and other sniper units were the ones to shoot both the police and the protesters. According to the wounded protesters who testified at the trial, the snipers were seen shooting from the opposition-controlled Hotel Ukraina window, as well as from the roof of the hotel itself. This testimony is backed up by video taken by the BBC and other various Ukrainian outlets that were on the scene that day, including previously unreleased footage that purportedly showed snipers in Maidan-controlled buildings shooting down upon the crowd. Former members of the Georgian military, another country heavily influenced by the U.S. State Department to say the least, also testified that they and other groups of Maidan snipers were indeed in the Hotel Ukraina, as well as the Music Conservatory, and that they were ordered by the leaders of the opposition to fire on police and protesters alike. The medical forensics also backs this up, with the investigation concluding that the absolute majority of protesters were shot from the side and back and from top to bottom, which is consistent with the bullets coming from the Maidan-controlled buildings. While conversely, the prosecution failed to come up with an alternative to the evidence, despite having 8 years to do so. And to top it off, the ballistics showed that the bullets that killed the protesters did not match the police-issued ammunition. But perhaps most disturbing and damning is the fact that two leaders of the far-right Svoboda party stated in separate interviews that it was a Western government's representative who told them and other Maidan leaders just a few weeks prior to the massacre that the Western governments would stop recognizing Yanukovych as president only after casualties among the protesters reached 100. Which, if true, means the Maidan opposition was literally incentivized by the West to sacrifice a certain number of protesters and government forces simply to justify the ousting of the democratically elected leader. Incidentally, the 49 protesters who died on that day are now known as the Heavenly 100. And perhaps coincidentally, immediately after the massacre, the U.S. and other Western governments blamed the murders on Yanukovych, who was forced to flee, and officially began recognizing the unelected opposition as the new rightful government. A government that Assistant Secretary of State Victoria Nuland, who I mentioned earlier, and other U.S. officials were deeply involved in hand-picking, as this leaked phone call released almost 3 weeks prior to the massacre at Maidan reveals.
What do you think?
I think we're in play. The Klitschko piece is obviously the complicated electron here, especially the announcement of him as deputy prime minister. And you've seen some of my notes on the troubles in the marriage right now. So we're trying to get a read really fast on where he is on this stuff.
So I don't think Klitsch should go into the government. I don't think it's necessary. I don't think it's a good idea.
Yeah, I mean, I guess you think, what, in terms of him not going into the government, just let him sort of stay out and do his political homework and stuff. I'm just thinking, in terms of sort of the process moving ahead, we want to keep the moderate Democrats together. The problem is going to be Tynybok and his guys. And, you know, I'm sure that's part of what Yanukovych is calculating on all of this.
I think Yats is the guy who's got the economic experience, the governing experience. He's the guy, you know, what he needs is Klitsch and Tynybok on the outside. He needs to be talking to them 4 times a week, you know. I just think Klitsch going in, he's going to be at that level working for Yatsenyuk. It's just not going to work. Okay, I've now written, one more wrinkle for you, Jeff.
Yeah.
I can't remember if I told you this or if I only told Washington this, that when I talked to Jeff Feltman this morning, he had a new name for the UN guy, Robert Seri. Did I write you that this morning?
Yeah, I saw that.
He's now gotten both Seri and Ban Ki-moon to agree that Seri could come in Monday or Tuesday.
Okay.
So that would be great, I think, to help glue this thing and have the UN help glue it. And, fuck the EU.
It's certainly no revelation that the United States is responsible for overthrowing scores of other nations' governments. And by the accounting of political scientists at Carnegie Mellon University, between 1946 and 2000 alone, the U.S. has interfered in 81 presidential elections across the globe. But this intercepted phone call gives an unprecedented look into the mechanics of such clandestine operations. This is what's known as the deep state. These are the unelected governmental officials that remain unchanged and perpetually in charge regardless of the political party in office, let alone the will of the people. Victoria Nuland herself has gone from the Bush administration to the Obama administration to now working under President Biden. And unsurprisingly, Nuland got her way when it came to picking the new prime minister, as Yatsenyuk and the other new members of the coup-led government were officially selected in a limited session of parliament, as many elected members could not show up to vote for legitimate fear of physical attack by the fascist forces now in charge. And this is by no means to say that everyone in the Ukrainian government, and certainly not everyone in the country, are ultra-right radicals and outright Nazis. But because of these events, members of the Svoboda Party, the Right Sector, and other Banda-Right aligned forces were now enshrined in key positions in both the government and the nation's security forces, ostensibly giving them the power to keep everyone else in check and aligned with the goals of the West. Next time, we'll pick up things with the events post-coup, including how the different neo-Nazi groups have been wreaking havoc on the people of eastern Ukraine for the past 8 years, which started with the vandalization of anti-fascist monuments and outlawing Russian and other languages, sparking predictable backlash from many in eastern Ukraine, where, again, Russian is the predominantly spoken language. As for why the West is so interested in Ukraine to begin with, if you ask me, as with most American interventions, it can be boiled down to corporate greed. Unfortunately for Ukraine, due to their many major deposits of rare earth minerals and unparalleled soil and rich farmlands, they are a huge prize that the oligarchs of the West have been salivating over for years. Not to mention its close proximity to the US's geopolitical foe, Russia. But we'll explore these and other points further in subsequent videos. And again, none of this is to excuse anything Russia is currently doing. And I do believe Putin had other options besides a full-scale invasion. But Putin is not some Bond villain bent on world domination, as our media would like you to believe. And if the US and its allies' goals are truly as noble as they would lead us to believe, then why are they leaving out and covering up so much relevant context? Thanks for watching. Please like, subscribe, and share if you enjoy this type of content. And stay safe out there. Jana.
So that would be great, I think, to help glue this thing and have the UN help glue it. And, fuck the EU.
No, exactly. And I think we've got to do something to make it stick together, because you can be pretty sure that if it does start to gain altitude, the Russians will be working behind the scenes to try to torpedo it. And again, the fact that this is out there right now, I'm still trying to figure out in my mind why Yanukovych that. But in the meantime, there's a Party of Regions faction meeting going on right now, and I'm sure there's a lively argument going on in that group at this point. But anyway, we could land jelly set up on this one if we move fast. So let me work on Klitschko, and if you can just keep, I think we want to try to get somebody with an international personality to come out here and help to midwife this thing. And then the other issue is some kind of outreach to Yanukovych, but we probably regroup on that tomorrow as we see how things start to fall into place.
So on that piece, Jeff, when I wrote the note, Sullivan's come back to me, VFR, saying you need Biden, and I said probably tomorrow for an attaboy and to get the deets to stick. So okay. Biden's willing.
Okay, great.
Who was your highest level contact with the U.S. government in this period?
Я постоянно имел контакт с господином Байденом, вице-президентом.
У меня были частые с ним телефонные переговоры. Но дело в том, что господин Байден говорил одно, а в Украине делали другое.
And the U.S. ambassador?
Посол Соединенных Штатов в Украине постоянно принимал представителей Майдана у себя в посольстве. Мы это очень хорошо знали, мы это отслеживали. И создавалось такое впечатление, что в посольстве Соединенных Штатов существует штаб, который управляет этим процессом.